All right. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's virtual event featuring Mondavi wines. My name is Shannon and I am a part of the New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlet social team. We've got a super special event for you tonight as part of our 90 Days Around the World promotion. So far we've taken you all over the world to visit various different wineries, distilleries. We've met some of the industry's biggest brand names. And tonight we are actually joined by Master of Wine himself, Mark de Vere of Mondavi Wines. So in addition to Mark, we are also joined by Chad Gibson, who is on the New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlets Wines marketing team. Mark has a super exciting presentation to share with us tonight, and I am here to share any questions with him that you may have. So please feel free to leave those in the chat, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook, and we'll make sure to get those answered for you. Make sure you leave any questions regarding inventory or availability as well, because Chad is here to tackle those. So for those of you that have pre-registered tonight, we are going to be giving away 5 $50 gift cards. I said that right, 5 of them. So we're going to actually be asking 2 trivia questions. So make sure you're listening very, very closely to tonight's presentation. We're also going to be monitoring the Zoom chat to those of you that are super engaged and are asking really great questions. Those are going to be the 3 winners of the remaining gift cards. So just make sure that you're listening really well and you're asking really great questions for Mark, and you will be entered for the chance to win one of those gift cards. So with that, Mark, I'll pass it off to you to get started. What can you tell us about Mondavi?
Thank you very much, Shannon. Good to be here or be with you. And I will do my best to tell you what I know about Mondavi Winery. But as you say, feel free to ask questions. I know we have a wide range of engaged wine lovers on the call today, so I'll be trying to enrich everybody's understanding of the world of wine, and especially of our wines as we go through this. If I'll try not to get too technical, but at the same time, I'll try and teach people who already know something about wine, teach a bit more. But if I use some technical phrases, if you want definitions, feel free to shoot them in the chat box. And if it catches my eye, sometimes I just get going. But if I notice it, I'll try and clarify what I've said. But with that in mind, I should introduce myself. My name's Mark. Thank you already for the introduction, Shannon. But Mark de Vere, as you can probably tell by now, although I'm calling you now from Napa. My home is in Napa. I live in Napa Valley. I've worked for Robert Mondavi Winery since 1997, coming up on 24 years now. You've can probably work out that I'm not from California originally. I grew up in Old England. I grew up in Oxford in England. Over the years, I've traveled a lot for Mondavi Winery. I've had the good fortune of visiting New England many times and been to visit New Hampshire many times. And I look forward to coming back in person when that becomes possible and practical and responsible thing to do again. I will be back. However, today, calling you from Napa Valley. And as I say, I grew up in Oxford. Hang on, let me get this out of the way here. I want to do, that's what I was looking for. I'm just going to show you a few slides. I'll try not to show too many slides, but just some things to help give you a feel for where we are. So this is the walkway into Robert Mondavi Winery, which is one of the historic wineries of Napa Valley. It's I'm going to tell a bit of the story of Robert Mondavi Winery because it is so intricately connected with the story of California wine, or certainly Napa Valley wine. This is me. I introduced myself already. We had some questions about what the weather is like here at the moment. It's about 55 degrees, lows overnight down to 41 degrees, I think, tonight. These are some pictures I took a couple of weeks ago at the beginning of December. Just we've gone back into stay at home here, so I haven't been up valley for a while, but there's some beautiful shots of Napa in the late autumn, early winter. It's a beautiful time of year to be here, but as I say, it is looking a bit gray today. As I said, came from England. I started in the wine trade in Oxford, where I grew up. I worked in Australia for a while, and then I came to Napa Valley. In April 1997, I started a 6-month summer job working for this gentleman, Robert Mondavi, I'm sure everyone on this call has heard of Robert Mondavi, and of course the winery is named after him. It's amazing in this day and age. I do presentations even for some people who sell a wine, and there's a younger generation who don't know that Robert Mondavi was a real person. It's we live in a world of made up names these days, but Robert Mondavi was a real person and an incredibly inspiring person. And he passed away in 2008. It was 1 month before his 95th birthday, which I'm no doctor, but I think that's a good clue that having a glass of fine wine fairly frequently is maybe adds to a long and happy life. I'm going to give it a go anyway. But Mr. Mondavi died just before his 95th birthday, and many people would say that in his lifetime, he really revolutionized the wine business in Napa Valley or in California. And some would say that influence went way beyond just California, all around the New World, and his influence went back to Europe, especially to Italy and parts of France. So a very inspiring person. This is Mr. Mondavi in the center of this picture. So Mr. Mondavi was born in Minnesota. His parents on either side of him, or the taller people in the picture, were Cesare and Rosa Mondavi, and they emigrated from the Marche region of Italy in the early 1900s, along with many other Italian settlers. And of course, they brought with them much of their Italian lifestyle. And a very important part of the Italian lifestyle was having a glass of wine on the table with dinner. And so Bob grew up with wine on the table, often probably homemade wine and jug wine. It's that sort of cultural legacy that actually brought the Mondavi family to California in 1919. And you might think 1919, if that year sticks out in your head, you might think that's an odd year for a famous wine family to come to California. But actually, they came to California the year Prohibition began to get into the business of trading grapes, selling grapes, basically. Because you might know there was a little loophole in the Prohibition law, in the Volstead Act, that allowed heads of households to produce up to 300 gallons a year, I think, of non-intoxicating fruit juice and cider. And so Cesare Mondavi recognized an opportunity, moved the family to California, started buying grapes from the vineyards that didn't have wineries to sell their grapes to anymore, shipping the grapes back east, largely to other Italian settlers, and basically selling grapes, perfectly legal, selling grapes. And those grapes might have been made into homemade wine, which sort of snuck through that little loophole of non-intoxicating fruit juice and cider. So that's what brought the family to California. When Prohibition ended in 34, the family started making wine. They basically started buying and blending bulk wine. 37, they moved to Napa Valley. 45, they bought a winery and started making their own wine. However, in the 50s and 60s, even in Napa Valley, the majority of wine being made throughout California was what you might think of as jug wine, everyday table wine. Bob felt that in coastal California, Napa Valley in particular, we have the soils and the climate that he felt we should be aspiring to make what he called wines in the company of the great wines of the world. So a notorious difference of opinion with the rest of his family. He was basically thrown out of the family winery, and in 1966 founded his own winery, Robert Mondavi Winery, in Oakville in Napa Valley. And here's our logo. And you'll notice it says Robert Mondavi Winery and Napa Valley. And you'll notice every time I say the name of this winery, I don't just use the shorthand Mondavi, I say Robert Mondavi Winery. Now, soon after Mr. Mondavi founded the winery and inspired a lot of other people to join him in his mission of making world-class wines in Napa. Of course, the cost of land in Napa went up, the cost of making wine in Napa went up. It had always been part, though, of the Mondavi family heritage to have wine on the everyday table. So in the 70s, Mr. Mondavi started a winery over in the Lodi region called Woodbridge, you might be familiar with. And the idea of Woodbridge is to make good, classic, varietally correct wines at a much more approachable style and price point. In the early 1990s, we started a winery down in the Central Coast called Robert Mondavi Private Selection, really looking to take advantage of the cool climate of Monterey and the beautiful coastal breezes there and make wines that a bit more pop in flavor than the Woodbridge wines, a bit more aspirational than Woodbridge, but still not the quality potential of Napa Valley. So when we say Robert Mondavi Winery, that's what we're tasting today, and that's referring only to the original foundation, the Napa Valley wines, and that's where I work, and that's where I've been based for the last 24 years. And as I say, really existing to fulfill Mr. Mondavi's vision of trying to make Napa Valley wines in the company of the great wines of the world. And I think these days, to a large extent, Mr. Mondavi's vision has been realized, as it were, or recognized. And today, people know Napa Valley as one of the world's great wine regions. But it owes a huge amount to Mr. Mondavi's vision and his passion and his ability to encourage others. Really, the Robert Mondavi Winery story is with our reserve wines. So these are pretty rare, expensive, beautiful, hard to find wines. But the founding vision was to make wines in the company of the great wines of the world. And so when you find our reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, our reserve Chardonnay, these are wines that I would gladly put on the same table as any of the great wines of the world. Our reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, I think the recommended retail is $175, $180 a bottle or up there. So they're up there price-wise, but absolutely, this is what Bob wanted to do, was make wines that we can put on the same table as the first growths of Napa Valley. Sorry, the first growths of Bordeaux and the first growths of Napa. As I say, very inspiring leader. Would lend advice to anybody who wanted to make great wine in Napa. He'd lend equipment, he'd lend grapes, and so really supported the industry in Napa. And it's, a lot of people pointed out that it was a really visionary thing to do, because he basically encouraged and supported and lent people the resources they need to open up in competition with him, which was because he wanted to make Napa Valley a great winery and always embraced competition as something to challenge himself with and keep himself pushing quality forward. But a pretty visionary thing to do, I think, to support everybody who wanted to raise the quality in Napa Valley. And we're going to start off tasting this little trio of wines. So what we call our Napa Valley tier. So the reserve tier I mentioned, the real story of Robert Mondavi Winery is wines in the company of the great wines of the world, great expressions of more specific sites in the valley. Our Napa Valley tier is designed to make wines in our style, which I'll talk about a bit in a minute. We think a fairly distinctive style, but to make wines that are making wines that are classic expressions of that variety when grown in the appropriate parts of Napa Valley. So wines that capture the essence of the variety, but also taste like Napa Valley. We're not trying to copy the wines of France or any other great region. We're trying to make Napa Valley wines, an expression of this beautiful sub-region of coastal California, but we're trying to make them with what I would call a classic style. Now, I'm going to start by talking and tasting a bit about our Napa Valley Fumey Blanc. And it's one of my favorite wines. It's also a great wine to start the tasting with. If you're tasting along, feel free to join me now. But our Napa Valley Fumey Blanc, I like to start with this, firstly, because it's a great introduction to our style, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also, it's a great introduction to the Robert Mondavi story. And of course, the name Fumey Blanc ties back to the origin of Robert Mondavi Winery. Probably if you're into wine enough to be listening into our call today, you probably know Fumey Blanc is an alternative name for Sauvignon Blanc. So it's just the Sauvignon Blanc variety. However, what some people might not be aware of is Robert Mondavi invented the name Fumey Blanc, basically, or started the name Fumey Blanc in the United States. As you probably know, there are some beautiful dry Sauvignon Blanc wines made in the Loire Valley, and that's where he got his inspiration from. If you cast your minds back or imagine back to the 1950s and 60s, although Sauvignon Blanc was grown in California, it was almost always made as a sweet wine, and it was typically considered a fairly low quality variety. So when people saw Sauvignon Blanc on the label in the 60s, your expectations were that's going to be cheap and sweet. Mr. Mondavi, of course, knew that Sauvignon Blanc can make high quality dry wines. So 1966, he made a high quality dry wine and then basically had to find a way to market it, to explain to people that it was not just the old style cheap sweet wine. So in the Loire Valley, sometimes they call the grape Blanc Fumé. So he just took that name, turned it around, came up with Fumey Blanc. Instead of trademarking it or copywriting it, because he wanted anybody to join in the raising of quality in Napa Valley, as it were, he wanted to make it available to anybody. So instead of trademarking it, he went to the government and had them register Fumey Blanc as a legal alternative name for the Sauvignon Blanc grape. So in California, it's just a legal alternative name. So I love that story because it sort of speaks back to the foundation and the entrepreneurial spirit and the energy that Mr. Mondavi brought to the California wine business. I also think you can feel that spirit and that energy in this wine when you taste it. Delicious. Now, when I say this wine captures the essence of our style, if I were to sum up the Mondavi Winery style in one sort of soundbite, I would say it's about having presence in the palate without being a big fruit bomb style of wine. It's about having intensity and concentration and yet still being bright and fresh. It's about being ripe but not being overripe, and I'll talk about that. For those of you tasting along, I'll say what we mean by that when we get to the other wines. So as we go through tasting this wine, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about where it comes from, how it's made. Here, let me get my share going again. So here we are, Napa Valley Fumey Blanc, dry Sauvignon Blanc. Here's a picture of some grapes. It's not very informative, but it's a pretty picture. Now, most of the fruit for this wine, about 2/3, 70% of this fruit comes from, the Sauvignon Blanc fruit comes from our vineyard in the Stag's Leap district. So as you know, Napa Valley, it's only about 38 miles long, but it has a bunch of sub-regions within it. And Stag's Leap district is over on the east side of the valley and sort of 2/3 of the way down. Famous, of course, for beautiful Cabernet Sauvignon, but also one of our two vineyards in Napa Valley, Mondavi Winery's two vineyards in Napa Valley, and the vineyard that we have the most Sauvignon Blanc planted on. And in the Stag's Leap district, when we grow Sauvignon Blanc or Fumey Blanc there, it tends to generate flavors that remind me of like the citrus characters, lemon, lime, grapefruit character. It's also really racy and crisp and fresh. So it's got that beautiful sort of mouth-watering, delicious acidity to it. A little bit about, yes.
We actually have a really quick question from Karen on Zoom, who's curious how the California Sauvignon Blanc would compare to a New Zealand.
Ah, good question. So if we're talking about, let me get out of this and I'll share a bit. So the big difference, if I step back to the causes of that difference, as it were, in Napa Valley during the summer, our daytime temperatures gets much warmer. As you might know, the magic, as it were, or what makes fine wine growing possible in Northern California is we have warm days, sometimes hot days, but pretty reliably cool nights, which means even if it gets to be 90 degrees in the daytime, it'll almost always drop below 55 degrees, often 50 degrees at night. So those cool nights help preserve the crispness, but because we get those hot days, the flavors in the grapes in Sauvignon Blanc get riper. And so we ripen more into, and the ripening of grapes, you're developing some flavors, but you're also, as it were, ripening away from other flavors. So in Napa, we ripen into more of the fruit flavors. In Stag's Leap district, more of the lemon, lime, citrus. I was about to talk about our vineyard in Oakville, where Sauvignon Blanc gets more sort of peach, nectarine, stone fruit characters. Those are sort of riper fruit flavors than you'd find in most New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. Also, as we ripen away from flavors, when grapes, like a lot of fruit, you've probably, if you've had underripe fruit, if you've had underripe grapes, they can taste sort of what you might call green. And underripe Sauvignon Blanc tastes really sort of green and grassy. In Marlborough, they get to a point where those sort of slightly herbaceous flavors become attractive and appealing. And really one of the signatures of that compelling Marlborough style is that grassy, chili pepper, green herbaceous character. In Napa, the warm days basically ripen our flavors completely away from that. So short answer to your question is, in Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, you're much more likely to see the appealing side of those grassy, chili pepper, green aromas in a good way. In Napa, and certainly in our wines, you don't see hardly any of those characters. If there's anything of the herbal left, we might try and capture a sort of a sage, like the sweet herb character, but primarily it's going to be crisp, fresh, mouth-watering, but riper fruit that you'd find in our Napa Sauvignon, Fumey Blanc. How's that?
Great. That was great. She's saying she's drooling now. She can't wait to try it.
Well, and we definitely try to make wines that, one of my favorite words for one of our taste characteristics is mouth-watering. And the Mondavi Winery style in particular, we focus on that mouth-watering characteristic. So Stag's Leap, a beautiful region on the east side of the valley. Just for, not to get too technical, but it's kind of part of the romance of the wine. All these grapes are hand harvested. We have to do that because for this wine in particular, we want to keep the grapes in perfect condition. Also, by the way, what you can see in this photograph is a very important and typical part of the weather in Napa in the summer and autumn, fall, which is the marine layer, as we call it, that fog or low cloud. And so this picture was probably taken at 9 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts. And often the valley is sheltered from the sunshine until 10 o'clock in the mornings. And that's really significant for slowing down the heat accumulation in the coastal valleys in California, in Napa Valley in particular. So that's partly what helps keep the coastal valleys nice and cool here. Grapes come in whole bunches. We put the whole bunch into the press. Often what people will do for many wines is take the grapes off the stems before putting them to press, which is slightly more efficient. But we find that this much gentler process of putting the whole cluster of grapes into a very gentle press gives us a purer juice, and therefore we find a purer sensation in the wine. Just a point about Fumey Blanc. Some people, I think, have a miscomprehension that Fumey Blanc means it's going to be an oaky style of Sauvignon Blanc, and it does not mean that. Having said that, not to be contradictory, this wine is fermented in oak barrels, but only old oak barrels. And so we use the old oak barrels, which don't give any oak flavor to the wine, but they give a roundness and a richness to the wine. They also mean that we can age the wines, what in French they would call sur lit, or in English we call on the lees. So basically on the yeast. At the end of fermentation, the yeast falls to the bottom of the barrel, and then we'll actually stir those lees, stir the yeast up. And that helps give a deliciousness to the wine, because our Sauvignon Blanc has that beautiful mouth-watering acidity. In our wine is bone dry, no sweetness left in the wine, and so the barrel fermentation and the lees contact is what helps us to sort of offset that racy, mouth-watering, bright flavor in the wine. So that's the production of the wine, but no oak flavor. If you're tasting along with me now, you'll see you don't smell any new oak, no vanilla, no toasty character. We just want the character of the grape to shine through. I talked about Stag's Leap being about 2/3 of the fruit for this wine. The other third comes from our vineyard in Oakville, over on the east side of the valley. And Oakville, pretty much in the center of Napa Valley as you go from south to north, and our vineyards over on the west side of Oakville. Beautiful vineyards. That's some of our oldest vines. And a view looking from behind the winery. You recognize the arch and tower in reverse there because we're looking from behind. I love that picture of Mr. Mondavi toasting with a glass of Fumey Blanc. As I say, to me, this wine always brings me back to the story of Mr. Mondavi and that spirit of entrepreneurship and the energy. And when you taste the wine, intense, racy, bright, mouth-watering, and delicious. And a glass of wine, I can gladly drink a glass of wine as an aperitif every day. I never get bored of this wine. I don't know if anybody's tasting getting some good comments. I think some people are tasting along here. Sorry, I don't have time to read all the comments, but Shannon, thank you. If anything pertinent pops up, just
yeah, absolutely. So actually, we do have a question regarding the barrels. Are they all French oak or?
Yes.
Okay.
Good question. So nothing against American oak, and there are some very good American oak barrels, but Roland Mondavi was actually the first person to start using French oak barrels back in 1966. Nobody in Napa had used French oak barrels prior to that, but he knew the great wines of France obviously used French oak barrels, so he was the first to import French oak barrels. Over the years, did a lot of experimentation, with American oak, with other sources of oak. But what we've come down to, certainly for the last 30 years, is 100% French oak because it suits our style best. There's a sort of gentleness, there's an elegance, there's a finesse. So we only use French oak barrels at Mondavi Winery.
Awesome. And you talked a little bit about how chilly it gets there in Napa Valley. Do you ever have concern about the grapes freezing?
So it gets chilly, but it gets just below freezing, and that's in the winter. Now, if you were to go into the vineyards at the moment, there are no grapes on the vine, so we don't have to worry about the grapes freezing. Areas like Washington State, it can get so cold sometimes in their vineyards there that they can sometimes get damage from the vines freezing, but it doesn't get that cold here. It'll often get frosty, but it has to get significantly below freezing before you start damaging the vines. Frost can be an issue in the spring as the vines start to wake up from the winter dormancy in March, April, when the little tender, delicate green buds start to grow out of the vines. Sometimes we're still at risk of getting frost into April, May. There have on record been frosts as late as June in Napa, but really it's April that we're worried about. After the bud break, it can still often get below freezing, and that's where you can get damage to the buds. And what that does, it just sets things back. It can reduce crop. It's not a good thing, basically. But that's spring frost, and it's damaging the tender new growing shoots. So the grapes, we don't have issues with grapes freezing here. So shall we move on to the next wine? And let's see where we get here. So the next wine we're going to go to is, we're going to go down to the south end of Napa Valley and taste our Chardonnay, our Napa Valley Chardonnay. What have we got a picture here? Oh, here's a picture. So Chardonnay, of course, a variety, needs no introduction, of one of the world's most famous and favorite varieties. And Chardonnay is something that is obviously really taken off in California. Interestingly, there wasn't that much Chardonnay grown in California in the 50s. It's like 100 acres or so in the early 60s. So it's something that came about as quality aspirations rose and as Mr. Mondavi started to raise people's hopes, as it were, or aspirations of what to do with wine. So this is our Napa Valley Chardonnay, as I say, making a style which is classic to Napa, but classic to our vision, which means intense without being overripe. And so most of this fruit, it all comes from the south end of the valley. Most of the fruit comes from the Carneros region, which, as you know, is down in the very south end of Napa. When you go to the south end of Napa, it's much closer to the cold water of San Francisco Bay, and it's open to winds coming in off the Pacific Ocean. So it stays significantly cooler down in the vineyards in Carneros. In fact, most of the vineyards down here where we get our Chardonnay and our Pinot Noir grapes from, it would be too cold for Cabernet Sauvignon to get ripe. However, it's beautiful for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Of course, many of you will know Chardonnay and Pinot Noir varieties that first became famous and reached greatness up in Burgundy, one of the cooler regions of France. So appropriate that in Napa, it does its best down in the south end of the valley. It's a beautiful region. You can see this is one of our vineyards. Well, I don't know how well this shows up, but in the distance is San Francisco Bay. So you're within sight of the water, and that's sort of like the air conditioner for the vineyards down there. Even when the daytime temperatures warm up, that constant source of cool air keeps the air significantly cooler than up in Oakville, where we grow our best Cabernet Sauvignon. Beautiful rolling hills, different soil, different part of Napa, but it's a wonderful part of the valley and beautiful, as I say, for Chardonnay. Now, California Chardonnay can sometimes be pretty big. A lot of people almost associate California Chardonnay with rich, oaky, buttery styles wine. However, the Mondavi Winery style is different from that. And I always think, you know, what we're trying to make a style that is distinctly California, distinctly Napa, and yet we want it to have that Mondavi Winery feel of bright, intense, but not a big fruit bomb. So we don't want too much oak. We don't want the buttery characters. We want the bright, fresh fruit of Carneros to shine through in the wine. Having said that, we do barrel ferment most of the wine for the Chardonnay. Again, mostly old oak, maybe about 15%, 13, 14, 15% new barrels. So it just gives it a hint of oak, if you're tasting or smelling on, when you smell the wine, you might get a hint of that French oak, the appealing vanilla character, but we want the fruit to be the main character. And when you sip the wine, what we want is, compared to the Fumey Blanc, slightly fuller in the mouth, slightly richer on the palate. The acid is a little bit more subdued, but you get the sort of almost minerally feel in the Chardonnay. You do get a hint of the oak in the very background, and just a hint of the sort of buttery character that some people look for in the Chardonnay. But the main characteristic is that cool climate, fresh, bright Chardonnay fruit, and some of the sort of melon, super ripe apple characteristics coming through in the flavors. And so a style of Chardonnay that, to me, I find that people like all sorts of different things in Chardonnay. And if you want big, oaky, buttery, there's plenty of those for you. My personal preference is for this style that's still distinctly Chardonnay and still distinctly Napa Valley Chardonnay, but brighter, fresher, and in my mind, more drinkable. And this is a style that appeals to me, delivering Napa Valley Chardonnay, but still with the brightness and the freshness. So back to that sort of stylistic vision, as I put it out, is about having wines that have presence in the palate without having to be mouth-filling fruit bombs. And so that's what we're looking for in here. As I say, mostly old barrel fermented. We do ferment a small percentage, maybe 20%, 10 to 20% of the wine in stainless steel tanks, deliberately to emphasize the pure fruit character. When you ferment white wine juice in stainless steel tanks, you can help preserve the purity of the fruit character. And the Chardonnay already has enough richness. So a small percentage of the wine fermented in stainless steel tanks to preserve the brightness and the freshness. Most of the wine fermented in old French oak barrels to give a roundness with out oaky character, and a very small amount fermented in new barrels just to give that familiar hint of French oak and vanilla on the nose. I sometimes say it's, some people love Chardonnay, which is great. Some people think they don't like Chardonnay because it can be too much. So if you're one of those people who often thinks Chardonnay is too much, I often find when I present this to people, they say, oh, I don't normally like Chardonnay, but I like this because it has that mouth-watering brightness and freshness. So I sometimes say it's a Chardonnay for people who thought they didn't like Chardonnay. So give it a try if you haven't tried it for a while. I'm a fan. I don't know if anyone's toasting along, but I hope
actually, Eddie on our Zoom chat had a great question about what it is that makes the Chardonnays more buttery or less buttery.
Yes, so butteriness actually comes from when you taste buttery in a Chardonnay, it's typically the exact same flavor compound that gives butter its buttery character. It's a compound called diacetyl. And winemaking, where that comes from, is a process called malolactic. Sometimes people call it malolactic fermentation, but it's actually separate from the real fermentation. Everyone knows the main fermentation in wine is yeast converting sugar in the grapes into alcohol in the wine, basically. The malolactic is a separate conversion where instead of yeast, it's actually bacteria, and bacteria can have a positive effect, just like they have in making beautiful cheeses. They can have a positive effect in the right situations. And they actually convert one type of acid into another type of acid. Malic acid, which is apple acid, which is a fairly hard, crisp acid, gets converted into lactic acid, which is milk acid, which is a softer kind of acid. So the malolactic conversion has the effect of softening the acidity in the wine. It also has the effect of giving us a bit more roundness to the wine, just because there's been that second microbiological activity in the wine. However, sometimes one of the side effects, as it were, or byproducts of that malolactic conversion is diacetyl, the same compound that gives butter its buttery flavor. So when you taste butteriness in a Chardonnay, it's come from the diacetyl, which has been created during the malolactic conversion. Now, if we step back a wine, the Fumey Blanc had no malolactic, so zero diacetyl, no malolactic buttery character. In the Chardonnay we just tasted, we do some malolactic. We don't do complete malolactic, but we allow some of the malolactic to start. So you might get a tiny, tiny touch of the buttery character, but we stop the process or make sure it's finished before we get too much of that character, because we want the fruit, the carneros Napa Valley character to come through in the wine. So that's a microbiology class if it wasn't too technical, but that's basically what we're talking about when we're talking about malolactic and the buttery character in wine, in Chardonnay in particular.
Oh, that's great. We actually have another question regarding how long the Chardonnay is typically aged in the barrel before bottling.
So Chardonnay, not very long, but oh, where's my screen gone? You still there? Can you still see me? You can still see me, okay?
Yes, we can. It's just sharing your screen.
Oh, I'm sharing my screen. Am I? Oh, that's what. Sorry, I clicked something wrong. Oh, there we are. Okay, good. My whole screen went haywire. Chardonnay not too long in barrel, so only French oak, fermented in barrel and then aged for about 5, maybe 6 months in barrel. So not too long, just long enough to allow the characteristics to integrate. And just as with the Fumey Blanc, we will do some batonnage or stirring of the lees. So not too long in barrel, just enough to give it a roundness and it gives a harmony and an integration to the wine, but we're not looking to pick up too many oaky flavors. Cool. Now I was sharing this slide already apparently. So here we go. Are we ready to move on to the Cabernet?
Yes, absolutely.
Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. Well, I'll hold it up here, but you've got a picture of it on the slide here. So we love our Fumey Blanc, we love our Chardonnay, we love our Pinot Noir, but I think Mr. Mondavi's founding vision that Napa Valley should be recognized as one of the world's great wine regions, it's really Cabernet Sauvignon that has most convincingly put Napa Valley on the world wine map. And so we're starting off here with our classic Napa Cabernet, as I say, the reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, which comes only from the Tokelon vineyard, the vineyard right behind Mondavi Winery, is always the best of the best, the cream of the crop, the wine that we'd put on the same table as any of the first growths of Bordeaux. We're going to taste 2 of our other Cabernet Sauvignons today. This wine fits in line with the Napa Valley Fumey Blanc, the Napa Valley Chardonnay we tasted. As I would suggest, it's about expressing a classic expression of the broader Napa Valley terroir, as it were, the feel of Napa fruit. So this is blended from fruit from multiple different parts of Napa Valley. We have vineyards in Oakville and Stag's Leap, but for this wine, we also buy grapes from growers, many of whom we've been buying grapes from for 50 years or more. So long relationships. If I were to sum up what we're looking for in a classic Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, I'd say it's about dark berry fruit, that sort of black currant, blackberry fruit character. But we want it to be ripe, but not overripe. One of the sort of analogies I use is if you think of the feel you get from when you pluck a perfectly ripe summer blackberry off the bush, or perfectly ripe fruit in season, you eat it and it's fully ripe, but it's still got that pop, still got that excitement in your mouth. We're trying to avoid the flavors of jammy fruit or cooked fruit. We want it to be fully ripe, but still have that vitality and that vibrance of a perfectly ripe and fresh fruit. Also, when you smell this wine, it's I think that wine has more complexity to it, as it were, or more interest to it than just the fruit characters. So, well, we're obviously back to what we mentioned with Sauvignon Blanc. Underripe grapes can have an unpleasant sort of green character, but as they ripen, that greenness goes away. However, sometimes there's a positive side to herbs and sort of dried herbs, dried sage. Geneviève, who's been our chief winemaker for many years, came from France. She sometimes talks about the garrigue character, the wild shrubberies and bushes that grow wild in the south of France and have that distinctive, the sort of positive side of dried herbs. So might get a little bit of that. And as I'm smelling this now, I'm tasting the 2018 vintage, which I believe is what you have in stock now. There's a hint of one of the classic sort of tasting descriptors for Cabernet Sauvignon, and also used in Bordeaux, is like pencil shavings and graphite. Like for anybody who still sharpens your own pencils, or if you remember that smell. And this wine has a little bit of that character too. So yes, it's got ripe fruit character, but yes, we embrace the sort of non-fruit complexity, because to me, that's what keeps wine intriguing and interesting, is almost not being able to put your finger on exactly what you're tasting. And when you taste the wine, again, back to that feel I was talking about. When you take a sip of that, you know you've got wine in your mouth. It's intense, it's got presence in the palate, but it's not a fruit bomb. It's got presence that doesn't rely on its weight. It's got intensity, a concentration. One of the things I love is, if you've just taken a sip of that, you've probably noticed the flavors keep changing in your mouth. And again, that sort of hallmark mouth-watering finish. It's bright from the beginning. You get that beautiful ripe fruit character, but as I say, it's like perfectly ripe summer berries. So it always, I hope, one of our goals is to leave your mouth watering for another sip. There are plenty of other wines out there. If you do like big jammy styles of wine, there are plenty of those, and nothing against it. It's just our style. We look for something a little bit more restrained, a little bit more classically proportioned. And to me, I often find that sometimes the wines that are overly ripe and juicy, when you first take a sip, sometimes they can go a bit flat after a while. Whereas to me, this wine, bright from the moment you take the first sip, stays alive and vital all the way through the palate. And then if you think about the way it leaves your mouth feeling, to me, it's that sort of mouth-watering appetite for another sip. And so we want to make a wine that draws you back for another sip, that engages you. And I hope we see that through our whole range. It's not 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, by the way. The Chardonnay, by the way, was 100% Chardonnay. Fumey Blanc, by the way, does have a few percent of a related, or not related grape, but an often blended grape called Semillon. And in the Fumey Blanc, a little bit of Semillon gives just a touch of texture to the wine without fighting against the freshness. Cabernet Sauvignon, it's very common for other varieties, compatible varieties, to be blended in. And so they're sometimes known as the Bordeaux varieties, because in Bordeaux, these were the permitted and traditional varieties. Excuse me, I have to refer to my notes to get for anyone. I'll say this just because often people will ask, what's the blend? But 87% Cabernet Sauvignon, 5% Merlot, 4% Petit Verdot, 3% Cabernet Franc, and 1% Malbec in this wine. So the usual varieties that you might find blended into a Bordeaux blend, as it were. 87% Cabernet Sauvignon. Those of you who are familiar with wine legislation, as it were, by law in California, if you put the name of a variety on the label, it has to be at least 75% made from that grape variety. So in this case, 87%, so well above that threshold. But it gives us, and I think it's it's a little controversial. Some people say, well, if you say it shouldn't be 100%. I think in this case in particular, this wine tastes like Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a much better guide to what the wine's going to taste like than if we just call it red wine. And those related varieties are, well, they're not technically related, but they're so traditional in part of a Cabernet Sauvignon blend that I think it still tastes like Cabernet Sauvignon to me, even with those other little varietal portions blended in. And this wine, I know we had people asking about the oak. Again, only French oak at Mondavi Winery. It's about 20% of the barrels for this were new. So those 20% of the barrels give just a hint of oak character on the nose, but not too much. We just want that little bit of familiar character. But on the palate, again, the most important thing is the fruit is the character that shines through. And about 16 months in barrels. I noted those numbers down in advance because I don't tend to remember statistics very well, but I know some people like to know.
Mark, we have a question about the grapes that are purchased from other winery or vineyards, I should say.
Vineyards, yeah.
Is it because you like the flavors that they're imparting, or just so that you can make more of your wine?
A little bit of both. It's for this blend in particular, we want the diversity of flavors coming from different growing regions within Napa Valley. It's also, it's not so much so that we can make more of, but always, when Mr. Mondavi started in the valley, he always bought grapes. He always wanted to support the grape growing community as well. And so our own vineyard ownership is not quite enough to make all the wine we want to. So it's not about making more. It's about having to own less vineyard, I suppose. We are one of the larger vineyard owners. Our vineyard in Oakville is about 430 acres. Our vineyard in Stag's Leap District is about the same amount of in size, same amount of acreage. However, we've always gone beyond that and bought widely through the community. In the early years, in fact, 1966, when Mr. Mondavi founded the winery, he didn't own any vineyard. And so in the original vintages, he was buying all the grapes for the wine and gradually expanded ownership of land. But obviously, real estate's expensive, especially in Napa Valley. And so it's good to have a balance of growing our own grapes and supporting growers around the valley too, vineyards that just grow grapes for the sake of selling them.
Great. And we also have quite a few questions asking how Mondavi has been impacted by the wildfires of last year. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the fires were not a good thing, and we're still trying to work out the full ramifications of it. Fortunately, no structural damage to the winery, no damage to the vineyards, fortunately, in this fire. However, the smoke in the valley, the exposure to the smoke was not good. Fortunately, we had most of our Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir and a lot of our Chardonnay harvested before the smoke got bad. We're still trying to work out what the full ramifications of the fires will be for Cabernet Sauvignon, because of course anything that we put in a bottle labeled Royal Mondavi Winery would have to be pristine and perfect and not have any of the negative effects of smoke exposure if we're going to put it in a bottle. So we're still trying to work out the plausibility of that, but there's a chance we might not be able to make any Cabernet Sauvignon from the 2020 vintage. If you do see a wine from us from the 2020 vintage, you can trust that it's been through a very, very rigorous selection and approval process before it gets our label on the bottle. Not a good thing for the fires, but it's still trying to work it out. Hope that's enough of an answer.
Yeah. We also have another question regarding what grape varietals you currently grow.
So what varieties do we grow? In our two vineyards in Oakville and Stag's Leap District, we grow Cabernet Sauvignon and its blending varieties, so Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Malbec. And we grow Sauvignon Blanc and its blending variety, a tiny bit of Semillon. That's what we'd have on our Oakville vineyard. We also have some of that on our Stag's Leap District vineyard. The only addition is there's a little bit of Chardonnay in our Stag's Leap District vineyard, which would go into the blend. We do not currently grow our own Chardonnay or Pinot Noir. Chardonnay and Pinot Noir we buy entirely from growers. We don't have our own vineyard in Carneros at the moment.
Great. Awesome. So before we move on, I am going to talk a little bit about our 90 Days Around the World promotion, which most everyone by this point is pretty familiar with. So as part of that promotion, we're actually offering all of our viewers the chance to win some really great prizes. So grand prize is actually the ability to build your own at-home bar with a $2,500 gift card to the New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlets. And including, or in addition to, you're actually going to have one-on-one guidance from our team just to be sure that you pick all the right products to stock your bar. So you may be wondering how you can enter for a chance to win. It's super simple. You just need to head to your app store and download the Scavify app. That's spelled SCAVIFY. And you are going to earn points for every event like you are tonight just by entering a code word. So make sure you're listening for that. Tonight's code word is Pioneer. So make sure you go ahead and enter that on the Scavify app. The more points you earn, the bigger the prizes that you're going to be entered to win. Mark, do you think this is a good time to ask one of our trivia questions?
Sure, fire away.
All right, great. So the first trivia question we have for one of the $50 New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlets gift cards is, what year was Robert Mondavi Winery founded? Go ahead and type your answers. We've got quite a few. All right, so I am going to select, it looks like we have Lokesh Madhwani. The correct answer is 1966. So congratulations. The $50 gift card will be going over to you. So if you wouldn't mind just messaging me your email address, we'll go ahead and get that routed for you. Do we want to go ahead and ask the second one, Mark, or do you want to talk a little bit more?
Sure. No, ask the second one too. Why not?
All right. Awesome. So second question, in which sub-appellation of Napa Valley is Robert Mondavi Winery located? Ooh, we've got some mixed responses. Wow, we've got, this one's actually pretty tough. People are all over the board on this. Awesome. Okay, so the correct answer here is Oakville. And so congratulations to Greg Simpson. You are our winner for that second $50 New Hampshire Liquor and Wine Outlet gift card. So.
And I had mentioned that, so I think it was a fair question for people paying attention.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, our winery is in Oakville, over on the west side of Oakville.
Awesome.
That actually leads into the next wine nicely.
Perfect.
So I'm just gonna share another picture. What do I do here? See if this works here. So the on the right hand side is our Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon that we just tasted. On the left, the Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, as I say, the icon wine. We have another Cabernet Sauvignon which sort of fits stylistically and qualitatively between the two, and that is our Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's what we're tasting next, Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon. And with the idea, as I mentioned, as we all now know clearly, this is where Mondavi Winery is based. It's where the Tokelon vineyard, our main estate vineyard right behind the winery, is based. Back in the early 1990s, as sub-regions or sub-AVAs, American viticulture areas, were being recognized within Napa, Mondavi was very involved and engaged in recognizing these sub-appellations. So we wanted to make sure we had wines that used those sub-AVAs. So the Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon we've been making since 1992. And it's really focused on expressing the character of this particular sub-region within Napa. As I say, it's not a very large area in Napa. It's only 38 miles or so from the south end to the north end. But as I mentioned already, down in the south in Carneros, where it's where we grow Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, down there it's too cool in most of those vineyards to ripen good Cabernet Sauvignon. But as you move north in the valley, it gets more sheltered from the ocean wind and further away from the cold water of the bay. Generally, as you move up the valley, move north in the valley, it tends to get a bit warmer the further north you go. So Oakville is sort of like the sweet spot for us, where we can get the grapes fully ripe, but we can still preserve the brightness and the freshness in the fruit. And it makes it easier for us to avoid the jamminess that we don't want. Our vineyard right behind the winery is called the Tokelon Vineyard. As you can see from here, mostly purple is Cabernet Sauvignon. It's actually a name that Robert Mondavi revived in after he bought the land. There was a winery on this site back in the 19th century where they traded under the name Tokelon and labeled their names Tokelon. So it's actually one of the very early registered trademarks, first registered in 1887 in Washington, the Federal Trademark Office in Washington, D.C. So a very old trademark, basically went out of use with Prohibition. So it hadn't been used for a long time, but Miss Mondavi wanted to revive the historic name, as it were. So that's why we call this vineyard Tokelon. There's a little photograph, obviously Mondavi Winery in the center, and Tokelon Vineyard is behind and to the left, as it were, and you can see how it nestles at the foot of the Mayacamas Hills, the hills on the west side of Napa. It's I put this slide in, by the way, all our own vineyards, very sustainably farmed. Mondavi was one of the pioneers of natural farming, sustainable farming. We're various certifications, fish-friendly farming, California certified wine growing. In Napa Valley, there's a third-party certification by the Napa Valley Vintners, Napa Valley or Napa Green. We've got it both for the land, and I think it's kind of cool. We've also got it for the winery. So it's really in our culture to be environmentally friendly. So in fact, currently our To Kalon vineyard is farmed in accordance with organic protocols. We haven't got certified yet, but we farm very, very gently and green. Oh, that's a picture of Bob back in the late 60s, holding a bunch of Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. As I mentioned, very inspiring leader. I love this photograph. It sort of speaks to the energy he brought to Napa Valley. So this soil, I'm not going to get too technical, but our vineyard on the west side of Oakville is what we call alluvial fans. So those are soils washed down off the hills. And typically what you'll see in this picture is that the gravelier pebbles get dropped first, closer to the hill, sandier particles in the middle jar, in the middle of the vineyard, and then the siltier particles closer to Highway 29, closer to the middle of the valley. Often the left-hand soil, the really free draining, purer gravel is where we get the purity and the power we want for the reserve. What we're tasting at the moment, the Oakville, is more likely to come from soil that looks a bit more like the middle jar here, slightly sandier, still amazing quality soil. But what this wine has is more sort of breadth, more richness, more ripeness in the flavors. There's a picture of how alluvial fans are formed. And so our Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon is about expressing the power we can get from those alluvial fan soils. It's about, as I say, halfway up Napa Valley. So it's about ripeness without over-ripeness. If you're tasting along here, you'll see much more richness and expressiveness than the Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. Much more of the sort of purity of the dark fruit. A little bit how this wine was made. We've actually upgraded in the last vintage to an optical sorter, but for many, many years, including up until the vintage, I think up to and including the 18 vintage, we did hand sorting to make sure that only perfect grapes get in the tank. This wine, like our reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, fermented in oak fermenting tanks. These tanks are now 20 years old. So it's not about oak flavor. It's about giving a gentleness and a polish to the fairly powerful tannins that we can get in Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon. And then pump overs during the fermentation, and then old-fashioned basket presses, beautiful artisanal processes in the winemaking, and then aged in French oak barrels. This wine may be 40% new oak barrels, and I think a beautiful expression of Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon. So if we're tasting this, as I say, much more aroma coming out of the nose, much more. It's also, I assume, I don't know if you're tasting the 16 or the 17 vintage, but always released with more maturity than the Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. So that gives it more roundness, more complexity as well. When you taste it, I think I can swallow it at this time of day. It's too good not to. It's rich. You'll see a step up in the power from compared to the Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, but still that freshness and that focus and that sort of vitality. So even though it's a step up in power, it's more obvious, it gives more in the glass, but it's still got that mouth-watering freshness. It's still got that feel of freshly picked, perfectly ripe, but freshly picked fruit. So it still pops on the palate. More of the dark berry fruit, more of that sort of blackberry. To me, Oakville, and especially West Oakville, my sort of soundbite for West Oakville Cabernet Sauvignon is dark black berry fruits and a sort of broad open feel to the tannins. The tannins are, which we want in Cabernet Sauvignon, is beautiful, fine, gently drying sensation. In West Oakville Cabernet, I sort of feel it around the side of my mouth, the gums, but in a very gentle, pleasant way. That's what the oak tanks do. That's what aging in the French oak barrels for 18 months or so will help to polish those tannins. Again, not 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. There's a bit of Cabernet Franc, bit of Merlot and some Malbec in this wine. Compared to the Napa Cabernet, though, we're taking, I don't know what I won't quote price, but it's roughly twice the price, I think, of the Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. And for that, you get much more intrigue, much more interest. However, as I say, still not heavy. We still want it to be bright. We still want it to draw you back. Mr. Mondavi had a famous expression or saying. He used to say, making good wine is a skill, making fine wine is an art. And we definitely believe we're involved in the art of making fine wine, art for the sense of flavor and for the palate. Sometimes people will say, well, what's the difference between good wine and fine wine? And of course, there isn't really a definition for that. So I made one up. And here's my way of explaining the difference between good wine and fine wine. If you have a wine that's just good, you might smell it and there's nothing wrong with it. And you taste it and it's clean, it's appealing, nothing wrong with it. But a wine that's just good, sometimes your second sip will taste exactly the same, your third sip the same again. And by the end of the glass, you're bored with it and want to move on. But to me, part of the essence of a fine wine is that every sip evolves across the palate. It's different from when your sip finishes from how it starts. Every sip draws you back for another sip, and every time you're drawn back for another sip, it rewards each sip with new layers of flavor, new intrigue, and keeps you interested. It should engage you and interest you. You don't have to think about it. It's all about enjoyment, of course, but it should engage you. It should intrigue you. And to me, every sip of a fine wine leaves you more intrigued, draws you back more. And by the end of the glass, well, of course, always drink responsibly, but we want it to leave that feeling of, leave you wanting more, leave you interested and captivated by the artistry of the wine. So that's what we're aiming for, is to make wines that intrigue, engage. And to me, that's what makes fine wine more rewarding on the palate, and more rewarding of our investment in a beautiful bottle of wine. So I know we're up to time, but we can happily go over for, yes, that is a very good price. I see somebody just popped up the price there. Thank you, Mitchell. That's a very good price. I think this one for that. That's delicious for that price. But again, I hope that's given you a good introduction to the Royal Mondavi Winery story. As I say, we always say Royal Mondavi Winery to refer to our Napa Valley wines, and Mr. Mondavi's founding vision, 1966, really changed the fortunes and the direction of Napa Valley, with the idea of making wines in the company of the great wines of the world. And that's what we feel we're still doing at Royal Mondavi Winery. That's our driving passion, is to continue to fulfill Mr. Mondavi's founding vision of making wines in the company of the great wines of the world. It's been a pleasure talking through our wines with you. Any more questions? Have you spotted anything, Shannon, that
yes,
we should address?
absolutely.
Yes.
So Judith was actually curious how it's decided if a grape goes into the Cabernet Sauvignon, the Oakville Cab, or the Reserve.
Good question.
Determining factors.
There's different ways to answer this, because of course it's an ongoing process in multiple ways. But the final question, or the final decision, is made based on tasting. So every vintage will line up all the grapes, after we ferment the wine, we'll line up every tank, as it were. We ferment each parcel of the vineyard separately, keep them all separate, and then we'll line up every parcel. Sometimes there'll be 100 different samples of wine lined up, and tasting is the main way we will decide. And it will taste for quality and style. As this have the quality and the stylistic characteristics needed to go into the reserve. And basically the reserve will be done first. And if it doesn't, it'll go into the Oakville district, then trickle down into the Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. That's the basic process. And only wines that have been tasted and, as it were, approved from that vintage will go into the reserve. Having said that, after over 50 years of doing this, we have a pretty good idea of which parts of our best vineyards are likely to produce the best fruit. And so each year, because we know that block is likely to go into the reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, it will get more intensive, more expensive, for whatever word, tending in the vineyard. It'll be made, as I say, in the oak tanks, if we know it's going to be destined for, or hopefully destined for, the reserve or the Oakville, and so on. So we have an idea year after year that's, we hope, a reserve quality block in the vineyard. Having said that, it'll only get into the reserve if it tastes up to standard, that vintage, based on tasting that vintage after it's fermented.
Well, everyone seems to have really enjoyed this. We do have a question regarding your personal recommendation, and maybe your favorite. I won't say favorite because I know it's hard to pick, of a middle of the road priced wine in this collection? What would be your go-to?
Well, it depends what you call middle of the road, I suppose. As I say, our reserve Cabernet Sauvignon is nearly $180 a bottle. So that I understand is a luxury occasion wine and beautiful. To me, as the Oakville Cabernet is 50. I think I saw $58 a bottle in your stores. If that's middle by some people's standard, I think this is a fantastic bottle of wine for a $60 a bottle. It's there are many beautiful wines in Napa Valley, but you can find some other wines for over $100, which you could happily put this alongside, I think. So that's my feeling on that. Yeah, the Napa Cabernet Sauvignon, I think is beautiful too. As I say, that's our expression of a classic Napa Cab. Thanks, Chad, for nodding. I like your nods there. I have to say that the least expensive wine we've tasted today is the Napa Valley Fumiglong. I know it's a white wine, and often you want a red wine too, but the Napa Valley Fumiglong is an amazing go-to bottle of wine. It's as a colleague of mine used to joke, it's almost always available by the glass at my house. It's a great wine to have a sip of the Fumey Blanc while you're trying to decide what to drink tonight. So it's a wonderful multi-purpose wine. The bottom line answer to the question, it depends what you call middle of the road pricing, I suppose. Everything's relative. I know we're very blessed to be able to taste and drink these wines at all, but we hope that they offer the artistry and the beauty and reward the investment in pleasure in each glass of these wines. So.
Awesome. So I'll ask one last one before we close out. Excuse me. So what is the life of a French oak wine barrel used for aging and processing?
So the life of a barrel and how long we would use it for are slightly different questions. Theoretically, a barrel, if it's well looked after and well tended, it could last 10, 20, even more years. However, it takes a lot of tending to do that. And the way we're buying new oak for some of our wines, and we always want a percentage of wines, I would say there probably aren't any barrels more than 4 or 5 years old in our cellars. So typically that gives us enough space for moving in the new oak barrels that we want as a percentage of many of our wines, and the right balance of gradually moving them through the system, as it were. So we've got plenty of previously used or neutral barrels for the wines that we do want to have in barrels that are not giving strong oak flavor anymore. So I'd say 5 years is the lifespan of a barrel at our winery, but we'll sell them. Other people might use them for other wines, and they can go on for a while.
Great. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been so awesome. I'm already seeing so many positive comments. Just thanking you, and just everyone's learned so much tonight, including myself.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. So I do want to announce the 3 last winners of our $50 gift cards. So the team and I have just kind of been monitoring, and we've had so much great questions, or so many great questions, so much great engagement tonight. So I want to thank everyone for that. So the decision-making process was a little tough with this one. But the 3 winners for those other gift cards are Laura Sales, David Bashaw, and Meg R. So if you all, I will place my email address in the chat window. If you would like to all email me with your mailing addresses, I'll make sure that you all get your gift cards. And for those of you that are still with us and you loved Mark's presentation tonight, we are doing this for the rest of the month. So if you check out the 90daysaroundtheworld.com website for the future events, go ahead and pre-register to make sure that you have the ability to enter some of these exclusive prizes like the gift cards tonight. And you can also rack up additional points in your 90 days passport. Again, tonight's code word for that is Pioneer. So like I said, we've got a great lineup of events for you. Tomorrow, for example, we are going to be exploring the toasts and tastes of Sonoma with Simi Winery. And again, thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Chad, for joining us tonight. This has been so great. And I hope everyone has a great night. And Mark, hope to see you again in person next year.
I hope so. Thank you for having us, Shannon and Chad. It's been great. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.